all of time and space. Everywhere and anywhere, every star that ever was. Where do you want to start?
We've escaped from the terrible cavemen and their even more terrible rock music, and what we really want to listen to now is some Queen. Come with us then as we explore the dead planet, looking for some Mercury. I'm Ian.
And I'm Mark, and welcome to All of Time and Space. In this episode, we'll be looking at the Daleks from 1963 with a very special guest. It's Dalek operator Nicholas Pegg, and he'll be joining us after this.
The planet is dead, totally dead. Whatever it was destroyed everything that was living.
Over 500 years ago, there were two races on this planet.
We are the survivors of a final war.
The Daleks and the Thals. Emergency! Emergency!
If I don't get the fluid link back, the four of us will die.
Daleks, the Thal people wish to live in peace. Let us work together to rebuild our world.
No! It's a trap! Get out of here! Run! They are to be exterminated.
This senseless, evil killing.
And welcome back. And our very special guest today is, I suppose you could call him the very essence of the Renaissance man. He's a writer, actor, director, musician, and he's responsible for one of the funniest spoofs ever invented, which is the UKIP shipping forecast. Have I left anything out there, Nicholas?
I think that sounds pretty good to me. Thank you very much, Mark. Gosh, that's quite a lead up. Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We've come to talk about the 1963 story, The Daleks, which you might know a thing or two about, Nick.
Well, I mean, I suppose. I'm being a Dalek myself, obviously I have a professional interest in it, but more to the point, I suppose, being a Doctor Who fan since I was knee-high to a nematode, obviously it has always held a big fascination for me. And I'm of that generation. I was thinking about this before we came on. It's quite interesting, isn't it? People who are older than me, even older than me, can probably remember seeing it when it was first on, but I'm not quite that old. I was born under the sign of the Abominable Snowmen Part 6, I think. And so for kids of my sort of generation who became fans of Doctor Who in the 70s, the earliest Doctor I can remember is John Pertwee. My route to this story was a weird sort of twisty-turny one. My first sort of acquaintance with it was reading the novelisation, which came out in the 60s originally, of course, but then Target reissued it. So the first version of it that I knew was that version, which is fantastic, David Whittaker's book of it. But of course, it's full of all sorts of strange. It's got that weird beginning for a start, which as an 8-year-old, I thought that was how Doctor Who started, or 7 or 8, however old I was at the time. And then, of course, it has all these wonderful embellishments later on, like a glass Dalek and those amazing swamp monsters, the sort of like Drashig type things. Which so that was my first version of it, and then. At some point in the 1970s, the BBC decided to show something called Doctor Who and the Daleks one morning on Saturday morning, and I watched that. And it turns out that whole thing about Barnes Common was wrong. Doctor Who actually started in a suburban living room with Roy Castle sitting on some soft centres.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Doctor Who invented it in his backyard, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. So by this, and that guy with the moustache looked nothing like the bloke in the book. It was really confusing. And then in, I think, 76, the revised version of The Making of Doctor Who came out. And that's exactly how old I am, you see. I didn't know about the 1972 edition of The Making of Doctor Who, but when that book came out, I snapped it up. And it was like someone had given me the Rosetta Stone, and suddenly it all made sense, you know. So
the veil is lifted.
Yeah, it turned out that was a movie, and the book wasn't quite right, because actually Doctor Who started with something to do with cavemen, and the Daleks was the second story. So that was my kind of... And then eventually, of course, cutting to the chase, I first got to see this amazing 7-part original story in the early 80s. There was a point when a sort of batch of episodes got sent around the country to various cinemas and film theatres around about 1984. And I saw it at the Phoenix Arts Centre in Leicester. They showed, I think, the pilot episode, and they showed the whole of the Dalek story and part 1 of the Web of Fear, and I think maybe part 10 of the War Games altogether. But the Dalek story was the big thing. So I was, I guess, about 16 or 17 when I first actually saw it. By which time, all these different iterations of it had been buzzing around in my head for years. But the amazing thing is that the original story does not disappoint. It is still the best version of all of them, isn't it? It's just extraordinary. And I think it's one of the... Oh, it's one of the great Dalek stories, obviously, but I think it is one of the great Doctor Who stories. It stands up so well.
And I think it's the reason why Doctor Who is still going now, to be quite honest with you.
Absolutely, totally, yeah.
Let me come in like a juggernaut here. Before we delve too much into the Daleks, there's one small matter we like to get out of the way at the top of the show, which is my quiz that I do.
Be able to avoid it.
Oh no, Mark! Oh no, we're doing the quiz. So let me fill you in, Nick, just to kind of establish what was happening in the cultural zeitgeist of the time when the show was broadcasting. I like to have a little quiz, just a few questions, just to humiliate Mark, basically. There's no shame if you don't get any of these questions right. The point is that he definitely won't, so that's why we're here. Okay. So let me kick off. Here we are. So basically, just shout out. I can differentiate between your two voices, and I can see you on the screen as well. So there should be very little confusion over who's answering. Question 1.
Just dive in when you know the answer.
Yes.
Okay.
Question 1. In January of 1964, because obviously this story began in December 63 and carried into, I think, February. So I've got quite a big gap there. In January 64, which international airport was renamed JFK International Airport?
New York Airport?
Is it Long Island? It's New York, isn't it? But
it is New York. But I'm not going to give either of you a point for these answers. All right, I'm going to throw out a very quick clue. There is a band named after this.
Is there now? We're doing awfully well, aren't we, Mark?
Oh yes, yeah.
Oh gosh,
I'm just dragging you down to my level, Nick.
It's not the Susie and the Banshees airport, is it? No, that's probably unlikely.
That's point to Mr. Pegg. No, the correct answer is Idlewild.
Of course it is. Of course, Idlewild Airport. Yes.
Yeah. So, 0 points each way. Moving into question 2. Born in Albuquerque, New Mexico in January 1964, which computer scientist would go on to revolutionise retail?
Oh lordy. Revolutionise retail. The inventor of the barcode.
No.
See, that's a really good answer, but it's obviously good.
It's a brilliant answer. It's a much nicer answer than the actual answer, which is a horrible answer.
I'd say something like the inventor of IKEA, but I don't think he came from Albuquerque, did he?
No, I'll tell you the answer, guys. It was our very dear friend Jeff Bezos.
Once you say it, it's so obvious.
That's yes. Question 3. This is my favourite question. A scale model of which iconic landmark was first unveiled to the press on the 18th of January 1964, including a 222-foot tall transmitting tower?
Oh, the telecom tower.
Yeah, the post office tower.
Incorrect.
Post office tower.
Is incorrect.
Is incorrect.
Oh.
Well, it's neck and neck between Nick and I.
It certainly is.
Absolutely.
I can't think of another thing. I'm so sure
Okay.
about that.
No, I was thinking Post Office Tower.
I think the mistake I probably made as a question writer is that maybe you both thought British only. It's actually the World Trade Center in New York.
Oh, yeah. See again.
Unveiled to the press. 64.
Yeah.
64,
So we
gosh.
are.
It's all going
it's
very
all
well.
square. It's all square. That's the way to look at it.
It's all to play for.
It doesn't matter if it's 0-0. You get a point each. It's wonderful. Right, someone will get this. This is very on brand. Question 4. 2,000 people gathered for a meeting at Birmingham Town Hall to listen to which art teacher's grievances in January 1964.
Mary Whitehouse.
Correct, sir.
Oh.
I've brandished the pen. I'm giving you a little tick. Fantastic.
Excellent.
It's 1-0. Very close. Final question. Question 5. The final question.
Pressure's on.
Which pop star has Mark Cockram expressly forbidden me from alluding to in any way, even though he was interviewed in 1964 about men with long hair?
That must be David Bowie.
Is it David Bowie?
Oh, I couldn't call that. That was kind of like simultaneous. So I'm going to give you both a point for that. So
He was
Nick
now
comprehensively wins. Well done, sir. Well done.
Well done,
Thank you very
Well
much.
done.
I'm honoured. I'm honoured. This award isn't just for me. It's for everyone who knows as much as I do about the events of 1964.
Well, I think we've nicely established what was happening in the world around that era, which is in many ways completely immaterial to the rest of the show. But nevertheless, this is my contribution to the format. Anyway, Mark, over to you.
Yes, Nick, this had a slightly troubled beginning, didn't it? The making of this story, because I don't think it was initially going to be the second story, was it? They had something by Anthony Coburn called The Robots.
That's right. Well, there was all sorts of, stuff going on in the very early development of Doctor Who, wasn't there? I mean, and books, literally books and books have been written about this. But at one point, Sidney Newman, who first cooked up the series with some, obviously the help of various other people, we know all these things. I think he wanted to start with the story that eventually became Planet of Giants, which wouldn't be made for another year. And then at some stage, there was this robots story. In the whole history of Doctor Who, all of which is fascinating right up to the present day, I often sort of, as a fan, I find myself thinking, nothing is ever as fascinating as season 1. It's just amazing what went on, and it's amazing what they eventually ended up achieving. But what was going on behind the scenes, no one knew from 1 minute to the next whether it was going to go on or whether it was just going to be a few episodes or whether it was,
they had to remount the first episode as well, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. That happened as well, which is extraordinary. Yes, I think Terry Nation came into it comparatively late in the day as a scriptwriter, sauntered in. I think, in his words, his approach was take the money and fly like a thief, or something like that. And he ended up just tying a couple of extra knots in the format, which made the whole show click, really. The first episode of this story, I think it was to do with feedback noise coming from the headphones in the gallery or something like that, wasn't it? They had to junk it, which is incredible. So you sit down and you watch this 7-part story. One of the extraordinary things that you have to bear in mind is that episode 1 was the version that we now know, because of course the original version was just wiped. Episode 1 was remounted and re-recorded in between the taping of parts 3 and 4 of this story. I think that's right.
Which confused William Hartnell no end.
Which they went back in and re-rehearsed it again for another week.
About that.
So, I mean, gosh, how fascinating it would be to see the original version of episode 1 and see how different it was, because in a way it gets to be, I suppose, more polished because they've had 2 goes at it. But then again,
they did make a few changes, didn't they?
They did. They tweaked a few bits about. Yeah.
The Dalek City model, the initial version, was very basic. I think the idea was that Raymond Cusick came up with this design and he gave it to Shawcraft just as a very basic design, hoping they would sort of embellish on it. And they literally just made the very basic design that he had given them, which he was not happy with some
pretty rubbishy mountains in the background.
So they got another chance to do that, and I think Carol Ann Ford got a chance to change her costume as well,
which
she was not happy about. So she went out shopping in November '63 and was able to pick up.
Can
I do
I
this
ask a
because
question?
I know this because I.
Yeah.
If they're re-recording this in between episodes 3 and 4, how can they be changing their costumes?
Well,
presumably because
I think,
she sort of complained about her costume after the failed version of episode 1,
Yeah,
and they said,
yeah.
"Okay, we'll change
So
it."
that was all.
Oh,
that
so
was
they
already
did
bought before
episode 1,
started
then they
recording
made the
episode 2.
changes. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was being silly.
Yeah, no, I guess that makes sense. Yeah. But no, that's incredible.
Nick, I'm from Essex, by the way.
And one of the other things that is compellingly fascinating about this story, in terms of what was going on when it was made, that's an amazing story. The thing about episode 1 being remade between episodes 3 and 4. But also, we all know that story that they had to go into the studio just after hearing the news of President Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know that Doctor Who started transmitting the day after that. But the actual episode that they were recording that night on the 22nd, because of course they recorded on a Friday evening, so that was when the news came through, was episode 2 of the Daleks. So the big episode, the episode with the big reveal of the Daleks, where they all get thrown in that cell and they're all lying around slumped against the wall with radiation poisoning, that's the episode that they recorded when they had just heard that JFK had been assassinated. And when you watch it with that knowledge, it's quite extraordinary, sort of moving, Vinny, that they must have all been thinking, shit, whilst making that amazing piece of television. And I wonder almost, I don't know if it's tasteless to speculate, but maybe that actually adds to the sort of tension of that episode, because it's an amazing episode.
To use a kind of modern parallel, we can all remember, I guess, trying to work the day after September the 11th, and we were all kind of numb and shell-shocked then, and how much more immediate would it have been for those three? So that really would explain that absolute kind of numb kind of shell shock that you could kind of see in their performances. Now that you've told me that fact, it does explain why it was so well drawn, well performed. Wow. Yeah.
And I think, something else that I just want to wildly enthuse about in this story is the performance of those 4 leads. Throughout that first season, they're all just so on point, and they're doing such amazing work. But the way that between the 4 of them, they're surrounded by this, wonderful design by Ray Cusick, wonderful music by Tristram Carey, which gets put on at the time, was added in while they were shooting it, I believe, so they could sort of hear the music. It's extraordinary.
Wow.
But the way that they convince us that, yes, it's a beautifully designed planet, but it's a planet of plywood and perspex in a tiny, tiny studio. And the way that they manage to convince us that it's real, that and that there's everything to play for, and they get sort of dirty and grimy and sweaty, don't they? It's such a it's such a visceral, and this happens a lot again in the early stories. It happens, of course, in the Caveman story and something like the Reign of Terror, where they end up in this horrible cell in the conciergerie prison. They always end up in prison cells, don't they? In the first season, there's so many scenes of them kind of slumped against the wall of a prison cell, defeated and desperate and hope running out. The Cave of Skulls and whatever, that's a sort of abiding feeling, and this story sort of is another one of those. And I love the sort of the sense of all or nothing, the sense of huge sort of work and sacrifice. And I think from Terry Nation's point of view, he was obviously a child of the war years, and I guess was, as a writer, a lot of what was in his head came from that perspective, and he'd been to see lots of, probably sort of flag-waving war, I should call them propaganda movies, but things like sort of Went the Day Well, and there's even, I'll tell you what, I know Terry Nation was a big fan of the Tarzan movies, which of course in many ways are problematic, as we now say these days, and quite right they are, so they don't get shown on TV anymore, and quite right too. But if you look at those old Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movies, for a start, there's so much Terry Nation material there, sort of jungles with hostile things and lost cities in the middle of them and lost expeditions and things like, you can see, and swamps and things. There's so much stuff that Terry Nation loves there. But there's also a sense of drama there, which I think you can actually see being replicated in the Dalek story. In particular, there's one called Tarzan Triumphs, which I maintain is a really good film, which is indeed that is the wartime propaganda Tarzan film. An awful lot of popular franchises were sort of roped into the, there's a Basil
did it with Sherlock Holmes,
Sherlock Holmes one, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the Tarzan one, sure enough, some Nazis, boo hiss, land in the jungle, and I forget what they're up to, but they're there for some reason or other. And the plot of the story is it's an absolute flag waver for American intervention in the war, because Tarzan initially refuses to get involved. He's all, Tarzan, nothing to do with Tarzan, stay in jungle, sort of thing. But then the evil Nazis kidnap Jane and Boy, his son, and take them away. And there's this really quite powerful scene where the camera tracks in on Johnny Weissmuller in his trashed treehouse when he gets back and finds that they've been there, and it kind of pushes in on him, and he goes, "Now Tarzan make war," or something like that. And it is so similar to the famous scene in the Dalek story where, Ian persuades the Thals that, so there is something you'll fight for, which is a wonderful, wonderful scene. And I'm sure all of it comes from, World War II, from as Terry Nation as a child, seeing things like that. Again, just fascinating cultural sort of little moments in time.
I think David Whittaker had a bit to do with it as well, because I get the impression from what I've read and what I've seen in interviews that they really were very excited about his ideas and the stuff he was throwing into the pot, but they just wanted a few more character beats in there, and I think that's where David Whittaker came in to just put a bit of flesh on the bone.
Absolutely. I think that is a sort of a bit of a running theme in the world of Terry Nation over the years, isn't it?
I was going to say, he's like this kind of flashman figure who just spends all of his time on the sofa in a crushed velvet suit, writing one side of A4 and taking all this money and then having these exciting adventures.
Later on there are outrageous stories about the Dalek master plan, and indeed I think early Blake Seven as well, where he would sort of have a couple of pages of A4 biked around saying, there you go, do something with that.
Flesh it out, workshop it. Yeah,
nice work if you can get it.
Raymond Cusick in an interview, he says, I used to find him really frustrating because he'd just write, the Doctor walks down a featureless corridor and enters a featureless room. He's like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Oh, well, I didn't really know what to write, so I just thought I'd leave it to the designers. Like, great, thanks.
Amazing. Yeah,
that is, because I was going to ask. Obviously, watching Doctor Who through in order. Obviously, this is only the second story, but this is the first time we encounter not only the Daleks but also Terry Nation, and it does seem to set out the Nation brand really quite strongly. Are there any tropes of Terry Nation, the writer, that we don't see in this opening Dalek story?
Gosh, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because you're right, there are so many, especially in episode 1. Terry Nation writes a brilliant episode 1, but it's quite often more or less the same episode 1.
Radiation tick.
Yeah, the TARDIS lands in a deserted environment, and our heroes come out and explore, and there's maybe a hostile forest, and eventually they find a dead body. That always happens. Now, in this story, it happens to be the dead body of a creature, the magneton thing, but usually it'll be there's that soldier in Genesis of the Daleks, or indeed in the android invasion. The Doctor and Sarah find the body of the guy who's just jumped off the cliff, and they find strange things on the body that are clues, and they make their way to the nearest settlement, and the episode always ends with the big reveal of whatever the monster is, usually the Daleks, of course, which has been a complete mystery up to that point, even though the story's title is something of the Daleks. And another one, of course, which we get in this story, which is repeated often afterwards, is Terry Nation loves the thing of the companion being pursued by a sort of mysterious, heavy-breathing, nasty person who turns out to be completely friendly and an ally. So in this one we have the Thals, and of course later on you have the Spyridons and the Mutos and all those sort of Tyson in Destiny of the Daleks. So it is a tried and tested formula, isn't it? But I'm dodging your question, which is there anything that isn't? There probably is.
We don't have any Tarrants in this story.
Yeah, there's no Tarrants. You're right, there's no Tarrants. That's right.
that might be it. There's no Davros, there's no Tarrants. That's kind of it.
Yeah, it is a Tarrant-free zone, isn't it? I'm just trying to think if any of the Thals have even a slightly Tarrant-y name, but they don't.
I'm sure there's a Talydon or something, or a Tally-Ho.
Because, of course, in Planet of the Daleks, many years later, when the Doctor meets the Thals again, one of them is called Taran, which is nearly Tarrant, isn't it? Yeah.
Bless. I think the direction in this is really very impressive.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a joint effort, wasn't it? There were 2 directors assigned.
That's right, Christopher Barry and Richard Martin, both of whom went on to do a great deal more, of course. Yeah, that's funny, isn't it? The idea of a story being divvied up between 2 directors is a weird... I mean, it happens. It still happens now, doesn't it? I always find that a slightly odd
I think it came down to Verity Lambert really wanted Richard Martin.
Yeah.
He was fresh out of director school,
Yeah.
for want of a better word. But I think the top brass were a bit nervous about having someone relatively inexperienced in charge, so they went with Chris Barry, and I think the idea was he was going to sort of shadow him. But Chris Barry also had other irons in the fire. He was setting up a period drama which was being filmed in the West Country, and he had to be off, so they split it.
Right.
Over a set number of episodes, and then Richard Martin took over once he was unable to carry on.
Yes.
But I think he does a decent job.
I think they both do a decent job. I think, I mean, it may just be the way that the script falls slightly as well, but I think Christopher Barry's episodes, pound for pound, are a bit stronger. But I think that's as much to do with the fact that, much as I love this story, if I have a criticism of it, it does peter out a bit at the end, doesn't it? I mean, the last episode is a bit of a sort of, how are we going to wind this up? Oh, just have a sort of fight and...
Turn them on their sides and walk off. That'll do it.
Switch the Daleks off. I mean, the final scene, the sort of farewell scene in the forest is lovely, but the actual defeat of the Daleks is a bit of a... Coming after that wonderful 6th episode, which some might call pure padding, the episode that largely consists of Ian and Barbara and the Thals in a featureless
featureless cave.
It's a fantastic episode. It's a really good, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's got that sort of, it's called The Ordeal, isn't it? And is that the episode?
That's right. Yeah, it's very tense.
It's really, it is a really, I think it's a wonderful episode for all its, yes, a bit of polystyrene comes off in his hand and whatever, but never mind. I think it's a wonderful, but whereas, the last episode, so it's not, you can't blame it entirely on Richard Martin, but it does. I think it does just end on a bit of a the movie version, for all its big broad brushstrokes and lack of subtlety, has the sense to end on a great big silly countdown clock that goes right down and ends at it just kind of gives it a sort of big woomph of an ending rather than a sort of slightly sort of hit and miss run around.
I think they did have the countdown, didn't they? But I think
they had a countdown in this, but no one, even the Daleks, could remember what it was for or what would happen when they reached zero.
I think the problem was they ended up the scene was stretched out. And they couldn't keep the countdown going, so they just had to stop using the countdown after a certain number had been reached.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that kind of took a little bit of the drama out of it, really.
It does slightly, doesn't it? Yeah, it is. There is a slight sense in which that last episode is slightly sort of ballsed up a bit, but it's okay. It's still, come on, it's still great. But from both of them, the direction all the way through, there's something truly, genuinely uncanny about the forest, the petrified forest, which is, by the way, just one of. I still think it's one of the most extraordinary sets that Doctor Who ever came up with. Of course,
well, you consider how tiny Lime Grove was as well.
Yeah, it was a tiny studio. When you see the floor plans and realise what a tiny, what they were working with, it's absolutely incredible. Some of the stuff that they managed to pull out of the hat in the space of one episode. That forest and the various different rooms in the Dalek city and the TARDIS in the same episode. It's absolutely extraordinary. They were tiny sets, but those incredibly clever designers and incredibly clever directors and camera crews managed, with all the tricks that they had at their disposal, to make them look bigger than they were. Forests are always quite a good bet for a set, aren't they? Because they have a sort of infinite background, as it were, you
can play the angles
and so I mean, Philip Hinchcliffe famously tells that story about Planet of Evil, doesn't he? About he would just ask Roger Murray Leach, well, what can you do well, and Roger Murray Leach would say, well, I can't really do a desert very well in the studio, but I can do a jungle, and that's why they would make it a jungle planet, that sort of thing. And this all makes sense, but it's not just that it's a jungle, though, is it? In the Daleks, it's got everything comes to pieces as dust, and it's just extraordinary.
It's really well realised when you consider they had a budget of tuppence halfpenny.
Yeah,
I think it's really good.
Absolutely beautiful. And the city is beautiful too. It's so, it instantly became, one of the sort of hallmarks of Doctor Who, didn't it? Those weird asymmetrical doors that slide open. And I was so thrilled, by the way, with my fast forwarding many decades, when we did the 2-part Dalek story with Missy and Davros.
With Peter.
With Peter Capaldi. When we first walked onto that set, that amazing set that Michael Pickwood had designed, the main control room, and saw all those doors the same and everything. I think we were slightly disappointed they didn't use the same sound effect for the doors, but never mind, you can't have everything. It was, and also going down those corridors, because they had corridors with that same sort of asymmetrical top. I have to say, I am totally full of admiration for the original Dalek operators. When we do it now, they prefer us not to cock it up, but if we do cock it up and bump into something, we can have another go. In those days, they really couldn't go again. Unless something went disastrously wrong and the entire set fell down, they kept it in. And I don't think there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think in that particular story there's a single Dalek sort of cock up, is there? They don't bump into anything or too badly.
I don't think so.
Sometimes later on there are a few. There's the Zarbi that we all know and love, who cannon straight into the camera. But I think in that
there's a great shot towards the end where there's a whole bunch of them all sort of in a semicircle, and then they all just reverse back out of the way when the goodies are coming down the corridors. And I thought that was really well done, because
it's lovely, isn't it?
I think they mentioned it in the commentary. It's like, wow, how did they do that? It was really well realised, and they all... I think it can't be underestimated. Obviously, from my point of view, I'm just seeing this as an outsider, but you've obviously got first-hand experience of when they came to cast the people who were going to be the Dalek operators. They weren't just going to grab people in off the street. They actually had actors who could learn the scripts, and they knew how to hit their mark. And it was really important, as you say, because you couldn't go again. Videotape was so crazily expensive.
Yeah, and the studio time as well was against them the whole time. Yeah, it is extraordinary. And they just did such a good job of it, didn't they? And it's something that even today we're still aware of. Just recently, of course, there's a Dalek episode yet to be seen, as you know, which I'm looking forward to seeing. And even on that one, we were doing some quite complicated moves. I am, of course, not allowed to tell you any details. But
no, of course not.
I have my copy of the Official Secrets Act just here that I've signed. We had a great time doing that one. And I think it's going to be quite a spectacular. But it goes on to this day that there are you'll be sort of talked through some moves in the studio, and it can take us sometimes half a dozen goes to get it right. So the fact that those guys were getting it right first time, so much of the time, I'm full of admiration. I really, really am. Absolutely incredible. I guess some of the setups were less ambitious in those days because they had to be, because the camera crew were all on one side. The sets were quite proscenium because everything pointed in the same direction, and the lighting was solid for the whole thing. That's different now, But it's a remarkable job, and quite a few of them stayed on and became regulars, didn't they, as it were?
Full-time Dalek.
Just talk us through a bit of what the sort of juggling act of being a Dalek operator, because it's more than just hitting the mark. You've got all these various things you have to do.
That's right.
Within.
That's right. It is, and I've had the great joy of comparing notes with Cy Town. Who's one of the old. He wasn't in that story, but he came in later on from the 70s onwards, and it's rather reassuring to learn from him that pretty much nothing has changed. It's exactly the same technology, if such it can be called. So basically, you get into your Dalek, the dome comes off, and then the sort of neck bit with the sort of concentric rings, that comes off, and then you climb into the next bit. I think in the old ones, the section with the plunger and the gun also came off, but on the ones we use now, it's solid up to and including the sort of midriff. You need the weaponry bit, So you need a little chair or a little step ladder to go up to get in, because it's quite high. Once you're inside, there's a sort of a plank. It would be dignifying it to call it a seat. But sometimes, if we're very well behaved, they let us have a little bit of foam rubber in there to sit on, just to take the ache off. So that's nice. So you're sitting on the plank in there, and it's open on the floor, and there are three wheels, one at the front and two at the rear at either side, and they're sort of like supermarket trolley wheels, those sort of ones that flip round 360 degrees, and the rest of it's open to the ground. So you're just like Fred Flintstone in his car, just sort of walking along the ground, you know. And as you know, as anyone who's tried to control a supermarket trolley knows, it's not always plain sailing. You have to, before attempting a sophisticated glide, you have to make sure that your wheels are aligned well to begin with. Yeah. And what inevitably happens in the studio when they're resetting us is that they'll say, right, Daleks reset, and we all sort of go backwards to whatever our starting points are. But when you go backwards, all those wheels flip around and face the wrong way, if you see what I mean. So when we get back to where we reset ourselves, we then have to do the patented Dalek wiggle, just to get our wheels back round the right way, excuse me, so that we get a nice smooth start. Anyway, this is all far too much information, but no, this is what it's like. And then in terms of above your waist, you obviously have the plunger and the gun. The rods from those just extrude into the inside of the Dalek, so you hold on to those and operate those, you know, move them around just with your hands. And then the dome with the eye stalk, in the old days, those were all manually operated as well, so you needed 3 hands to do everything, you know, one for the gun, one for the plunger, and one for the eye stalk. Because what happens is that hanging down from the dome is a sort of vertical stick, which is attached to the eye stalk. So if you pull the vertical stick up and down, it makes the eye stalk waggle up and down. And then with exactly the same stick, you sort of rotate it from left to right, and that makes the dome rotate. Now, we do still have those, and we do still use them quite often. But the great sort of bonus that we do have these days is that we have 2 or 3, usually, which are animatronic domes, which means that a man with a remote control, or sometimes a woman with a remote control, is standing behind the cameras, looking at the Daleks and operating your dome for you, which of course is great because you can concentrate on the other stuff. It doesn't always work, though, because those are a great boon to have, but the drawback of them is that the remote control thing only allows one speed, so the thing can only rotate, and the eye can only go up and down at one particular speed. So if the director wants the eye stalk to sort of whip round really fast, we have to do it with one of the manual ones, and so on. But so that's the rudiments of it, really. Oh, and of course, we have to learn our lines as well, even though it's Nick Briggs doing the voice. Nowadays, I forget when this came in, but it was not for the first couple of stories. I think maybe the Manhattan story was the first one where they got this working, or was it Stolen Earth? No, I think it was the Manhattan one, but Nick Briggs will be able to correct you on that. They managed to get it rigged up so that Nick Briggs's voice, which he does do live on set, actually activated the lights at the same time. But up until then, we had a little button inside the Dalek that we had to press on and off in time to the voice. So obviously we had to know which Dalek was speaking at which time and what the lines were. So that's what. So we still have to learn the lines, because even if you're not controlling your own flashing lights, you have to sort of. You know, wiggle about a bit when it's your line, or whatever the case may be. That's interesting as well. Some different directors have different theories about that. Some directors like the Daleks to be very, very minimal with their movements and stay very still and very impassive and only make tiny little moves. Other directors are very keen. And Graham Harper, for example, is very keen on the Daleks being quite manic and kind of whizzing about the whole time and wiggling about and looking like they've kind of got this pent-up sort of furious baby inside that can't control itself, which I quite like. I like both of them, actually. I can see the you know, but basically, you know, as with any acting job, a large part of it consists of doing what you're told. So you'll see that in different stories, and that is largely down to the directors. The extent to which the Daleks are sort of, you know, immobile or wiggly is very much the directors.
So if you're being asked to move and flash your lights, I know you don't have to do that so much these days, but move, flash your lights, fire your gun, and get the eye stalk going at the same time. That's quite a lot of plate spinning going on there.
It certainly is. Yes, it can be a bit of a head spin. At times it really can. Other times, of course, we just sit there completely motionless, and you do start thinking, is there really any need for a human being to be in here at all? As I have been for the last hour. But no, most of the time,
I'm sure I've heard your some of your other Dalek colleagues mentioning that because people get so used to them being on set, they very often forget there's someone inside, and they quite often will have sort of chats between shots without even thinking that There might be somebody listening from within the Dalek.
Recording their every word for future posterity. Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. I mean, it's in a way, it's a testament to what a brilliant design it is. So hurrah again for Raymond Cusick, because it is extraordinary that once that dome goes on, once it's put together, it's a Dalek. And people do absolutely forget that there's a person inside. And yeah, no, you're dead right. There have been times when we have probably overheard things that that would make your hair stand on end, because people have forgotten that they're within earshot.
I'm looking forward to your autobiography of your Dalek days.
No, the confidentiality of the Dalek confessional is sacrosanct. No, I mean, people do occasionally come up to us and whisper things through the grill as well in a sort of confidential, I've got to get this out of my system, so I'll go and tell a Dalek. That actually does happen as well. So that's good.
That would be great. You could set yourself up as a sort of Dalek therapist, and at the corner of the studio when nothing's happening, someone comes up and you go, "Tell me about your mother," or, you know.
I'll tell you what, when we did the Stolen Earth story, with so many wonderful people, of course, but the glorious Liz Sladen, who was my sort of companion when I was a kid, you know, she was exactly, you know, I was of the Sarah Jane generation. So finding out that we were going to do a story with her was just a dream come true. Absolutely incredible. And she was wonderful. I already knew her a little bit because I'd met her at conventions and things, but to work with her on set was amazing. And Liz, brilliant actress that she was the most modest, self-effacing person you would ever meet. And no word of a lie, at the end of a take, several times during that story, she would sidle up to me and my Dalek and whisper through the thing. She would just go, "Oh, was that all right? Do you think I was all right in that?" And I thought, Liz, don't ask me. Of course you weren't. It wasn't all right.
No, sorry, Liz, go again.
It was brilliant. It was fantastic. But she wasn't insecure, don't get me wrong. I think she was, you know, but she was so extraordinarily self-effacing and so completely unstarry and so concerned that the work be good. That she was constantly questioning herself, and that's the best kind of actor does that, you know. So she was. I mean, dear, lovely Liz. She was just. I mean, how much we all miss her, but what an amazing opportunity that was to work with her. Yeah. So people come and talk to us in our Daleks, which is nice. They sometimes say indiscreet things within earshot of Daleks, which is nice. But we're all very, very, very good about that. But yes, they do also just forget that we're in there. We have over the years had to become a little bit more sort of militant probably is not the word, but we have become a little bit better at going, excuse me, sorry, we really do need to have our lids off just for a breather now, because we have been in here for quite a long time. It's not because people
they will wander off for a tea break and just leave you in there.
Yeah, it has literally happened, or not for a good few years now, because we have got a bit more bolshy about it. But it's not because people are evil and nasty and don't care. It's literally just that it doesn't cross their mind because they can't see us. Yeah. And no, early on, when in the Christopher Eccleston series, when everyone was learning how to make Doctor Who, everyone was learning again how to do it, because nobody who made that show had made old Doctor Who, and it was in any case being made under totally different conditions. So we all had to learn these things. And there was a day on the Dalek spaceship on that story, I think it might have actually been Chris's final day, but anyway, that's by the by, when we were, Barnaby and Dave Hankinson and I were inside our Daleks, and this is not an exaggeration because we measured it, for 5.5 hours non-stop. Wow. And when we crawled out at the end of that looking rather sorry for ourselves, we did all just sort of get together in the bar that night and say, right, that's not going to happen again. And it hasn't.
The Daleks Union.
Yeah. But, you know, it wasn't anyone's fault. It was because there was no time. Time is always short. Everyone's wanting to get on with it. And you don't want to be creating a problem for anyone. You don't want to sort of make people tut and go, oh, God, the bloody Daleks want to come out again. But you've sort of got to at some point. Otherwise, you know, we're all just going to die in there. But no, it's...
I hope you don't mind me asking, Nick. You are a taller gentleman.
I am a taller gentleman.
And historically, Dalek operators have been quite small.
Yeah.
Are there any sort of problems you encounter through being a taller person that others don't?
I do okay, actually. As I said earlier on, you do sit down inside them. So once you're sat down, tall or short, you sort of when you're tall, a lot of the tallness is actually in the legs. That said, yes, of course, I'm a taller, much taller than Barnaby and Dave and some of the other people. And, I'd be lying if I said it was comfortable in there, but I think that's the same for everyone. Yeah. It's not, it's quite cramped. I don't suffer at all from claustrophobia or anything like that, which is probably just as well. Not the best job in the world.
Well, yeah, it's quite handy.
If you're claustrophobic. It can sort of press down on the back of your shoulders sometimes when you're a bit tall. Just different Daleks have different interiors, by the way. Some of them have a lot more chunky wood. It depends on which particular carpenter was on that day making that one. So you do when you're doing an episode, you start sort of getting acquainted with all the.
Did you have your favourite Daleks?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And is there a pecking order between you?
We do sometimes fight over them. No, we don't. We sort of we're quite. I think we're quite good about it. We pool our resources. If you've been in one and discovered that the front wheel is a bit knackered or something, which sometimes they are. So some of them move better than others. And it changes on a day-to-day basis. A bit of WD-40 and job solved. But we will sometimes climb out of one and just warn the other guys. Say, well, the left-hand wheel on that one's a bit shit. We do that because it's just useful to know these things before you get into them. But if there's a particular scene where a Dalek needs to be seen careering down a corridor at a rate of knots, then obviously we'll try and make sure that it's one of the good ones. Because even though they're made to exactly the same specifications, it's just one of the laws of nature, isn't it? That some of them come out slightly better than others.
Yeah.
It sounds to me, and I had never really thought of this before, but there's a lot of overlap between operating a Dalek and being a Formula One driver. It helps if you're short. You're sitting in a cramped environment that hasn't really changed on the inside for about 50 years, and you're operating an unlimited number of things that most people couldn't get their heads round. So, you're basically Ayrton Senna or Jensen Button.
I suppose so. I think you're absolutely right, Ian. Yeah. Hadn't occurred to me. Probably not quite the same speeds involved, but can get close.
That is true. That is true. Yeah.
I feel like we ought to have a Jensen Button of some sort inside there.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. He's still quite busy. He's racing in America, so he's sadly not available. But probably Damon Hill or someone could be press ganged. Anyway, I wanted to just quickly to step back to the Daleks and talk about some of those visual effects in that story, because I wasn't expecting effects that good or that ambitious to be part of Doctor Who from the get-go. So things like the whirlpool, or there's that panel next to them where they're being shot at, that kind of bubbles
where it sort of blisters.
Yeah.
There were some incredible effects. Even and in terms of set design, the lake looked amazing, and so who are we thanking for that, and how much of the show's future can we hang on the brilliance of those early forays into VFX?
They're incredible. They're so ambitious, and they're so. It's amazing that they just went for it, because I suppose they didn't have to. That first sequence where they find the city and go and look at it. There's that wonderful inlay shot of our heroes standing at the edge of a cliff, and the city in the background, which is a model, and it's been it's a composite shot. And they could have just had a reaction shot of them going, "Ooh, look at that," and then cut to a shot of the city. But no, they went for it, and they did this amazing composite shot. So the constantly pushing the envelope to try and create this sense of spectacle. And as you said, that whirlpool in the swamp, and there's the lift in the Dalek city as well. I mean, it's obviously just it's very, very simple lighting and models and things, but the way it's done is so fabulous.
When you also consider the technical side as well, when they didn't really have post-production back then, so there's a vision mixer and there's all these other people involved just cutting between various pre-filmed bits of footage and live effects and all sorts going on, and it all just comes together really well. Yeah,
it's incredible, and as you say, contributes massively to the success of the show, I think, because of course we can look at it now and go, it's a bit primitive, but there's something so impressive about the fact that they just kept on pushing that envelope as hard as they could. And I don't think they're that bad. They're yes, of course they're 60-year-old effects or nearly, but they're actually pretty good. They're pretty bloody good.
I think it stands up incredibly well.
It's incredible, really, what they did from one episode, and it keeps going through the story as well. There's a lot of old Doctor Who stories, maybe a bit later on actually, this started happening more maybe in the 70s, would sort of top load the story. Episode 1 would be a spectacular with lots of location filming and exploding spaceships and everything, and by the time you get to episode 3 they're running up and down 2.5 corridors. But
I want to come in very quickly and just mention Trial of a Time Lord, which is the absolute high watermark of that phenomenon. The entire season's money goes in the first 5 seconds.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the that's the par excellence.
That's the example.
It certainly is, isn't it? But yeah, in this at this early stage, they it's just, I guess this is Verity Lambert as much as anyone else, very very cannily making sure that it's spread across. That you see some money on screen in every episode if you possibly can. Barry Letts famously pointed out that thing. I remember. At the time when I first read this interview, I was very young and it had never occurred to me, but he said, of course, the most expensive episode of any Doctor Who story is episode 1, because that for episode 1 you have to build the planet and the monsters and the new sets and the new everything, and that's absolutely true. But going back to these very early stories, I think you can still see that there's a sense that yes, each serial had its own production code and its own setting and its own director and whatever, but it's actually an ongoing episodic series and people sitting down to watch these things wouldn't have any idea whether this was going to be a 4-part story or a 7-part story or a 2-part story or whatever it was. And the fact that they keep of course some episodes are going to look cheaper than others, of course they are, it's just the way it rolls. But the way that the spectacle is maintained from one week to the next right through the season is absolutely incredible. And I know, as I say, also that the fact that people didn't know. I think maybe if you bought the Radio Times, did it say the 3rd episode of a 7-part serial or something, or did it not even say that? I don't know. I'm not sure. But I know there are definitely. You can see things in 60s Doctor Who where they're actually playing with the fact that the viewers don't know how long this story is. I mean, at the end of part 4 of this story, they get back to the TARDIS, the Daleks have sort of been defeated and the Thals have sort of learned a lesson or something, and then they realise that they still haven't got the fluid link and it's not over and they've got to go back to the city. That's a fantastic cliffhanger, because it's especially as this is only the 2nd story, so I suppose if you were already a fan and keeping tabs on how this show works, you would be aware that the first story was sort of 4 parts. So this story, we've got to the end of part 4, but then suddenly, no, there's more. And then, later on, I love the way that 60s Doctor Who plays with these things. The end of part 2 of the Ark, much later, a couple of years later, ends with them saying goodbye. They've defeated the plague of common cold and everyone's lived happily ever after, and the Doctor gives a little speech about how nice it'll be if humans and monoids can live in peace together, and they get in the TARDIS, wave goodbye and go, and it really feels like the end of a story. And then the TARDIS lands again in the same place they come out, and you get that amazing reveal that the statue's been completed and it's hundreds of years later. And that's never happened in Doctor Who before. That's the first time, I think I'm right in saying, that's the first time that the TARDIS had ever gone back to somewhere that it had already been, let alone back to the same place as it's just been. So that was a shocking moment, as it suddenly, the viewers would suddenly go, oh my God, there's more, we're still on this story. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling away like crazy now, aren't I? But
you're in good company.
But no, I really love the way that this story, like a few of Terry Nation's actually, sort of meanders a little bit and goes down unexpected alleyways and suddenly introduces a new notion, like having to go through the jungle to the Lake of Mutations to get round the back of the city and all this sort of stuff. It's great. It feels quite epic, doesn't it?
Yeah. We haven't mentioned the episode 1 cliffhanger, have we?
No, we haven't. Now that's
quite a big thing in the day.
That's probably something we ought to mention, isn't it? Yeah, that is an amazing moment. It's again so beautifully shot. It's so sort of raw, isn't it? And of course they had 2 goes at that. We're in episode 1, the one that got reshot. That's an interesting thing. I believe I'm right in saying that the reprise in part 2 is actually taken from the end of the junked part 1, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
It's certainly different. from the one that you see at the end of the transmitted part 1. So that's interesting. Yeah, it's amazing. And what a brilliant... What a brilliant idea, of course, not to reveal the monster straight away. And that's the moment, isn't it? That is the moment at which Doctor Who becomes a hit. It's got that cliffhanger.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Just fantastic. Was it Michael Ferguson operating the plunger, is that right, I believe? Who later became a Doctor Who director.
I think you're right, yes.
He was PA or something on that.
Yeah.
I believe so. I'm lurching it forward to the modern day again. When we were doing the Bad Wolf Parting of the Ways story, or the 5.5 hour story, as we like to call it. There's a scene in that.
Not bitter
where,
in any way.
Not in any way. No, I'm not dwelling on it after all these years. Certainly not. No, God forbid. No, it was such an amazing episode to work on, though. Joe Ahern, fantastic director. It was an amazing. You could tell while we were making it that this was going to be really good. It was very exciting to be doing it. But in the scene where Rose first comes face to face with the Dalek again, in that episode, we sort of redid. The idea was in Joe Ahern's head and in everyone's, I think, that was that we were redoing Barbara with the plunger. From the, because you do get that, and that was Barnaby. Barnaby did the plunger, and it was, we were kind of, I don't think we actually got the old thing out and looked at it, but there was definitely a sense of trying to recreate that amazing Barbara cliffhanger just for that little moment, as a sort of little tribute. It's fantastic, isn't it? And I love the fact as well that it doesn't. Even at the beginning of part 2, you don't get instant gratification. It fades to black after the plunger, and then there's a whole other scene with Ian and Barbara, and just when you've with Ian and the Doctor rather, and Susan, and it leaves you just long enough that you've stopped thinking about whatever that thing was menacing Barbara, and they come out of the room and the door opens, and suddenly there they all are, swarming in up to meet them. Fantastic. That's such a weird and brilliant reveal of the Daleks. They don't appear in full at the end of an episode. They suddenly whoosh in about 3 or 4 minutes into an episode. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
It was, as you say, that was the moment that Doctor Who went from probably having a 13-week run to being an open-ended kind of property. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think a lot of the credit for that has to go to Ray Cusick, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible design. So, dictated by economy and by budget and by what could be achieved in the studio, and within all of those constraints, such a brilliant thing. That, I mean, it's nearly 60 years old now, and people still jump when they see a Dalek, don't they? And of course, also Ray Cusick. The Daleks are amazing, but as I said earlier, the city is amazing, the models are amazing, that everything he did on this story is just exemplary.
I have to say that the most kind of immediately mimicable element of a Dalek, if you're a 7-year-old in the school playground, is that voice. And obviously we all know about ring modulators and Nicholas Briggs, but who was it who kind of came up with that voice originally? Because that, I think, is a huge part of the success of them.
Yeah, well, it's Peter Hawkins, isn't it, in the first story? Did David Graham do them as well in the first story? Yeah, I think so.
Peter Hawkins and David Graham are in the first story, and Brian Hodgson from the Radiophonic Workshop was involved in creating the sound, and I think he worked very closely with Richard Martin.
Right. Yeah.
Because Richard Martin was very worried because a lot of the story was hanging on the dialogue between the Daleks. Yeah. So he wanted them to be otherworldly, but he wanted them to be intelligible.
Yes.
So I think they spent quite a while working on that.
Yeah, it is quite noticeable, isn't it? Because of course they were just working out. They didn't know what the Daleks were any more than anyone else did to start with. The people who were making this program, they were working.
The Thals didn't know what the Daleks were.
No, absolutely. But it's very noticeable in that, particularly in that first story, but also in the, even when you get to the Dalek invasion of Earth and the chase. The Daleks are much chattier than they become later. They speak in longer sentences, and they do say some slightly odd things in the first story. Isn't there a few questions will resolve the mystery or something? One of the Daleks says a line like something like that in the book. And that scene where they get Susan to write a letter to the Thals, there's some really odd Dalek dialogue in that.
Yeah.
And that's fine because they hadn't. It's only
part of the evolution, isn't it?
It is, absolutely, and it takes until the chase or the Dalek master plan for them to really have the speech patterns that we now associate with Daleks. I did, as a very sad fan, a few years ago, have a look at the use of the word exterminate And I think I'm right in saying they talk about extermination in this story, but the first time the actual word exterminate is used is not until the Dalek invasion of Earth. And even then, it's the Black Dalek saying something like exterminate them. The first time you actually get a Dalek going exterminate, just like that, is in The Chase.
Yeah.
So
wow.
Yeah. And I think the first time you actually get a Dalek going exterminate and firing, as one action, is in the last episode of The Chase when they confront the mechanoids. So isn't that interesting?
Because I was very struck when
the evolution.
One of them says Dalek 1 says to Dalek 2, they must be exterminated. You understand? Like you'd think that would be probably if a Dalek was going to understand any concept, it would be extermination. But obviously, at this point, they're still, I'm not going to say benevolent, but they are less immediately hostile. You think of them disabling Ian Chesterton by taking out his legs for a short period, rather than just casually blowing him away. And I wonder if that was because Terry Nation, I think I've answered my own question, whether Terry Nation wanted them to be slightly more rounded and have slightly more ambiguity and depth to them, or whether they just hadn't kind of evolved or devolved into the more one-note creature of hate that we see today.
I think you're absolutely right. I think, again, I think he was, taking the money and flying like a pigeon. Maybe he didn't even mind that much. Maybe he hadn't devoted a huge amount of thought to it. But yeah, I think to begin with, they're not these space Nazis that they later become. And in fact, I believe that in an early version of the script, or the storyline, the breakdown, whatever, that he provided, I believe an early idea was that a third race was going to attack from space or something, and that was what was going to make the Thals and the Daleks realise that they had to settle their differences and fight together against a common enemy, which is another bit of a kind of a war movie type trope, isn't it? Obviously that would have been a totally different inflection on the whole thing, and probably would have been a bit of a bog standard science fiction story that we would have all forgotten. It is quite ruthless the way the Daleks are sort of destroyed in this story. There's that wonderful bit at the end. I mean, we were saying that the last episode is a bit of a botch up, but there is actually a lovely bit. The final confrontation in this story between the Doctor and a Dalek is the bit where the Dalek comes up to him and says, you must reverse the whatever it is. And Hartnell just stands there and says, I don't know, even if I could, I don't know how. I think he's something like that, isn't it? And he's quite sort of brusque about it, he's not. He doesn't say it in a particularly sympathetic way. But of course, as we know, the first Doctor, particularly at the beginning, is quite he's a force to be reckoned with, and he's not always a terribly nice man. So it's interesting, isn't it? The Daleks there are moments in this story where you almost feel sympathetic towards the Daleks. That doesn't really ever happen again after this, does it?
No, I think that's got to be true. I'm going to rack my brains to think
maybe Dalek.
Victory of the Daleks.
Well, that's true. That's true.
But then, of course, that's part of its plan to get to Rose. But
wow. The other thing to mention is obviously William Hartnell. Someone gifted him some hairspray at the start of recording this story. He's got this incredible booth out here. It's what do we think? Do you think that they washed the wig that day and
that's an evolving thing as well, isn't it? In those early stories, sometimes it's all Brill cream down, nice and in this story he does. It's all over.
I'd say it's full on a Blackman, basically.
Absolutely, the full. He's got it caught in a Kathy Gale somewhere. Yes, the William Hartnell's hair. That's a whole evolution in itself, isn't it? It really is. And of course, I suppose we ought to mention Barbara's hair as well, since it's the most glorious hair in television history. Not yet at its full magnificence. I think it peaks around about Planet of Giants, doesn't it? When it's 4 times the size of her head.
But there is that sequence in this story where Ian and Barbara fall asleep by the side of the swamp, and then they wake up and Ian looks like he's had literally 30 seconds lying on his back on the studio floor, whereas Barbara's hair is all smunged up and she's got bared hair, and it just lends so much realism to this. You can't imagine actresses now would agree to do that.
No, absolutely no. It goes back to what I was saying earlier on, that they don't hang around in sort of snazzy designer outfits, sort of looking immaculate in every shot. No, absolutely, they really get put through the mill, don't they? Jacqueline Hill is an extraordinary actress. I mean, they're all great. It's invidious to pick anyone out, but she's so good, isn't she? You can never. There isn't a single moment in her performance as Barbara over those 2 years or whatever it is that
she's such a constant all the way through.
Absolutely
brilliant,
spot on the whole. I mean, the pair of them, Iain and Barbara, are just the most adorable companions, the most adorable couple of all time.
I was watching them earlier, and so I think it's probably end of part 1. Barbara's just walking around the city, and you notice she's got this kind of interesting blouse thing which buttons up down the back, and it just seemed so kind of specific and accurate that it made her, and by extension Iain, seem so real and so the man in the street transplanted to this alien world in a way that I don't think any companions since have really managed to be that authentic and seem that ordinary.
Yes, and I guess it's partly a function of the fact that this is a new programme and the format is not yet set, and the viewers at home are as confused as everyone else. And so the story of season 1 is the story of Iain and Barbara discovering what it's like to be in Doctor Who, basically. And they do, in this story and in several others, they have that wonderful little moment outside the TARDIS at the beginning, don't they, where they stop. Susan and the Doctor have already gone off, and they stop and have a little chat about, there's one in the Cave of Skulls episode, and there's one in this, and there's another one in the Reign of Terror, when they just arrive there at the Doctor. Of course, those scenes were partly because, for purely technical reasons, they had to give a bit of dialogue to 2 people to allow the other 2 people to move on to the next set, because it was all being recorded live. Certainly the one in the Reign of Terror is like that. Iain and Barbara have a chat outside the TARDIS while William Hartnell and Caroline Ford get themselves into the barn set, which is the next bit, and then the camera cuts to it. That happens quite a lot, but it allows for those beautiful little character moments, which maybe they are only there for technical reasons, so that the other people can get onto the next set, and so that camera 2 can move around and get in the right position for the next bit. But what beautiful little moments they are. They are.
I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to say, Nick, before we come. We normally at this point will rate it out of 10. But,
gosh, well, we've covered quite a lot of ground, haven't we? I mean, I love this story. I'm sure every Doctor Who fan loves this story, but it's one of those ones that you can just go back to again and again, and it never disappoints. And I do still find new things in it to enjoy and to admire. We're so lucky that it still exists. We're so lucky. We're so lucky that it was made, because the rest of Doctor Who would, if it had followed on behind, would have followed on behind in a very different way. No, it's great. I will unhesitatingly give this a great big 10 out of 10.
Excellent. Ooh. Iain, what about you?
Even though I found it quite challenging to sit through some of episode 6, because it is basically 20 minutes watching 6 men leap across a 1 metre wide chasm, but really encouraging the cowardly member. I thought that was a wonderful bit of character work there. So I'm going to give it a very mealy 9.5 out of 10.
Oh, it's not so bad. That's not so bad.
It's respectable.
Okay. Well, I gave the first story, I think it was an 8 out of 10. And I think I enjoy this quite a bit more, so I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I'm going to leave myself a little bit of wiggle room in case there's something that really knocks my socks off later.
Excellent.
Great. Well, that's enough about what we think. Let's hear what you guys out there think about the Daleks.
I've got mail.
So it's time for your feedback, and we have heard from Paul Quinn. That's at Paul L. Quinn on Twitter, and they say, crucial in shifting the programme from Newman's original education vision. Without the Daleks, Doctor Who wouldn't have lasted a year. The Doctor is still untrustworthy, the first cliffhanger remains one of the best, the sets are great, but the last 3 episodes are hard work. Oh, okay.
I mean, that's a great comment, because that does encapsulate into one sort of pithy sentence what we've been wanging on about for over an hour at this point.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
Good work, Fat Man.
Very good, yes. A lesson for us all there. Conciseness. Yes.
We also have Dwayne Bunny from the Sirens of Audio podcast.
Oh,
he
I know
says,
Dwayne.
shivers through my whole body. Ah.
Hello, Dwayne.
Yes, he's a big fan of Big Finish. So, Dwayne says, shivers through my whole body at the episode 1 cliffhanger. So yes, when I asked for feedback, I put up a little gif of Barbara being harassed by the plunger
Harassed.
at the end of
I haven't heard
episode
harassed
1.
since
Yeah.
some mothers do have them. I'm being harassed by a Dalek.
And we have Tim at Doctor Who Podcasters who says, superb. Imagine if it was missing. Yeah, well, it did come fairly close, I think, when Mr. Levine was doing the rounds, trying to make sure that these things didn't get binned. So, yeah, we have to be thankful for that. And the last one from me is from Craig Hansen, and they say, 10 out of 10, just feel bad for Raymond Cusick. Yeah, well, I can certainly identify with that one. Ian, what have you got there?
So I have a very long sort of four tweet movement, if you will, from Isaac Heeks at Isaac Heeks on Twitter, who begins, the Daleks have always and will always, he's very, and will always look best in black and white. I think that's the reason that the Dalek movies, while brilliant, lack the same creepy value that they did in the 60s. However, when shot sparingly and shrouded in mystery, they still work today.
So that's a very interesting point. The Daleks working so well in black and white. Yeah, it's a fair point. Of course,
Yeah.
interesting. The effects, again, primitive though they were, it's incredibly effective when they fire their guns and the screen just sort of whites out and goes negative. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
We didn't actually get laser beams coming out of the Daleks at all until the Tom Baker stories, did we? You know, it was always it's always that sort of screen effect until then. That's a very good point, I think.
Yeah.
They
So
are very
back to
effective in black and
Isaac.
white.
He continues, crucially, the Daleks work so well here because of the cliffhanger of part 1. You see the tiniest part of the Dalek, but Barbara's blood-curdling scream tells us whatever is on the other side of that plunger is the most terrifying thing you've ever seen. So you come back next week and know that this Dalek is terrifying. And when the Dr. Susan and Ian encounter them for the first time, the fact that they immediately gun down our action hero just proves that they are ruthless. They have no remorse in doing it. In an epic adventure, too, because you're genuinely left with a sense of hopelessness, because of this lack of remorse from the Daleks, the main characters could simply die at any moment. This, coupled with the fact that they are total unknowns to us, is a perfect example of Alien.
Very good. Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
That's like a little mini essay. That's
A
great.
little doctorate there.
And Nick, I believe you got some feedback as well.
I have. I've also got a bit of a mini essay here. This is from Jeff Goddard, who says, this is a masterpiece of 1960s television, let alone sci-fi. A story that seems old hat to us now, maybe, but at the time, following on from An Unearthly Child, I can only imagine how impressive this was to first-time viewers. It's no wonder the Daleks took off, is it? It oozes atmosphere from the start, with lots of lovely TARDIS and action and interplay between the four regulars. The sets and model work are seriously impressive considering the confines of the studios. Ray Cusick's design work here just oozes style, not least in the Daleks themselves. The cliffhangers for both of the first episodes are otherworldly, firstly with that encounter between Barbara and an ominously waggling plunger, and then Susan peering out of the TARDIS doors at the threatening and lightning-lit forest, preparing for the return journey to the Dalek city. With the radiophonic score from Tristram Carey adding yet another level to the otherness of the story, it's all incredibly unsettling. I know people feel this one drags in the middle to a fairly rushed climax, but I love all of it. The world building, the character work, the lake of mutations, big smiley there. I knew I was in love with the Hartnell era after watching the first episode before school on my 11th birthday when I got the VHS tapes. The Daleks would of course go on to bigger and better things, but this is pure comfort sci-fi of the highest order. Were I a score giver, it would be a perfect 10 from me. There we go. Oh, and he puts,
there you go.
And he puts, see, I even forgot to mention the devious Doctor and his near-fatal curiosity. Love it. Yes, that's a good point too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff.
I'm really glad that he brought up the subject of the Part 2 cliffhanger. That is another amazing moment. Such a strange, unsettling moment, again, when the rules of Doctor Who have not yet been written. Susan in the TARDIS doors. It's terrifying. It's this young girl on her own in a storm. We know there's something out there that's hostile. And you get that sort of echoey flashback of Ian's voice saying straight there, straight back. It's really really scary and really sort of filmic in a way. It's wonderful cliffhanger. Yeah.
Excellent stuff. Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for your feedback. It's always great to hear from you. If you want to get in touch, we've got all the various ways of getting in contact at the end of the show. So, Nick, lastly, just thank you so much for coming on and chatting about Daleks. It's been fantastic.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much for inviting me on. Consider me available for any future assignments, as Amelia Ducal
Wonderful.
said.
Wonderful work.
Is there anything you've got on the go that our listeners can enjoy from you coming out anytime soon?
Well, the thing that I've been working on a great deal recently, pretty much solidly actually for the last year or more, it's not directly connected to Doctor Who, but it does have quite a lot of actors and people involved in Doctor Who are involved in it, is a huge audio drama series for Audible, which is called the Waringham Chronicles. It's based on a series of historical novels by a German author called Rebecca Garblay, and these are the English translation of them, and it's a dramatisation of them. Although Rebecca Garblay is German, she writes about English history, so it's a great big swashbuckling historical epic set in the 14th and 15th centuries, follows the fortunes of a fictional family through genuine period of history, so that real characters, the kings and sort of other people involved in what was going on at the time, appear in the story, and our fictional heroes rub shoulders with them. So it takes you right through the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt, and we get to the Battle of Agincourt and Joan of Arc and all of these. It's an extraordinary period in history. Wow. It's all quite exciting. And anyway, my job was to write the English dramatisation of it. Audible had already done a German language version, which had been very successful, so they decided to do an English version. So I got sent all the sort of scripts of the previous. It was a huge undertaking because it is enormous.
How many
first three
scripts?
installments. Well, it's in 6 episodes, but it's not in 6 episodes like Doctor Who episodes.
Right.
Each episode is they vary in length, but they are many hours long. I think the episode 3, which has just come out, is I think about 17 hours long, something like that. So you get plenty for your money. Parts 1, 2, and 3 are already out, and I did work out that parts 1, 2, and 3 put together are longer than the entirety of Blake 7. They're 1.5.
Wow.
1.5 Davison eras in Doctor Who money.
With slightly less Servalan.
All with slightly less Servalan. No, it does have some marvellously scenery-chewing villains. So yes, there's all sorts of wonderful actors in it. People you'll know from Doctor Who are certainly in it. The lovely Jacqueline King, for example, who played Donna's mother in Doctor Who. She's in it. Yes, and oh gosh, I'm racking my brains now. Well, I'm in it, and so is Barnaby Edwards, who directed it. We've had an absolutely wonderful time doing that. All sorts of fabulous people in it.
Probably too many to remember. So that, if I want to listen to that, that's on Audible now, did you say? Or?
It's on Audible now. The first 3 episodes are available now, the first 3 installments, which, as I say, is a huge listening. It's called the Waringham Chronicles. That's Waringham, Waringham. And it's up there. So yeah, the first 3 are out. Unfortunately, having completed recording on the first 3, that's round about when lockdown happened. So although work on parts 4, 5 and 6 is ongoing, there's going to be probably a little bit of a gap before they get completed, but they will be out in due course just as soon as it's possible. It is narrated, by the way. Obviously it has a big cast, it has all these actors in, but it also has the voice of a narrator stringing it all together. It is narrated by the mighty and glorious Miriam Margolyes, who brings so much class and style to it, and she's just fantastic. So no, it's we're all quite proud of it. It's a good old thing, and it's what lockdown was made for. A good old historical blockbuster that you can listen to while doing your ironing.
Well, that's excellent. I'll put a link in the show notes so our listeners can check that out.
Thank you.
And thank you once again for coming on. It's been a real pleasure having you on.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Take care, guys. Look forward to hearing it.
Thank you. So, after all that adventure, we'll be taking it easy and just spending a bit of time in the TARDIS next time.
It's a kind of a lockdown story, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Yes. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email us at mailbagofrassilon@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter @TimeEndSpacePod, and you can also find us on Facebook. If you want to leave some audio feedback, there is a link in the show notes. You can use your phone or your computer and leave up to 60 seconds of feedback. Or if you're listening via the Anchor website, you can click on the message button and leave your audio. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you to Momo Tempo for providing our theme music. I'll try and hold back on the superlatives there, Nick.
Well, I don't know. Feel free on my account.
Let's not be humble, you know. Oh.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No. Let's go for it.
I think this is going in as an Easter egg at the end. Right.
Pile them on. No. The choice of adjectives is entirely in your court.
Oh, that's dangerous. That's very dangerous.